Okay, hey everyone. We're going to start here with our lessons on the Cold War. We're going to start with this packet here of to what extent was World War II responsible for the Cold War. So make sure you have this packet in front of you. We're going to work through some of these documents, go over the terms, and talk about the beginning of the Cold War. Before we get started, the first thing I want you to do is in your terms to know box, I want you to add a term here, satellite nations or satellite states. So I added it there to the worksheet now. Just add it to yours as well. It's going to be one of the terms that we'll come across and we are going to talk about here. Okay? All right, so let's get started here with to what extent was World War II responsible for the Cold War. So we're going to start here by going back in time a little bit, and we're going to watch a little bit of this video that was something called Duck and Cover.
Dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and Cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration and in consultation with the Safety Commission of the National Education Association. Produced by Archer Productions, Incorporated. Hey, Bert, come on out and meet all these nice people, please. Oh, all right. We really can't blame you. You see, Bert is a very, very careful fellow. When there's danger, this is the way he keeps from being hurt. Sometimes it even saves his life. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school. We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it, just as we are ready for many other dangers that are around us all the time. Fire is a danger. It can burn whole buildings if someone is careless. But we are ready for fire. We have a fine fire department to put out the fire, and you have fire drills in your school so you know what to do. Automobiles can be dangerous too. They sometimes cause bad accidents, but we are ready. We have safety rules that car drivers and people who are walking must obey. Now, we must be ready for a new danger, the atomic bomb. First, you'll have to know what happens when an atomic bomb explodes. You will know when it comes. We hope it never comes, but we must get ready. It looks something like this. There is a bright flash, brighter than the sun, brighter than anything you've ever seen. If you are not ready and did not know what to do, it could hurt you in different ways. It could knock you down hard or throw you against a tree or a wall. It is such a big explosion, it can smash in buildings and knock signboards over and break windows all over town. But if you duck and cover like Bert, you will be much safer. You know how bad sunburn can feel. The atomic bomb flash could burn you worse than a terrible sunburn, especially where you're not covered. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck, your face. Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by. In Betty's school, they are talking about the atomic bomb, too. Betty is asking her.
All right, we're going to stop the video there. If you'd like to see the rest of it, this is available on YouTube. It's like a little under 10 minutes that you see the whole video. But if you're not aware of this video, if you haven't seen it before, if you've never heard of it, this was called Duck and Cover. It was released in 1951 by the U.S. government. And let's think about it. Just based on what you looked at, what was the purpose of this video? So the purpose of this video here was to help children to keep themselves safe in case of a nuclear bomb attack or an atomic bomb attack. So it was shown to children in school so they would know what to do if they got attacked. Basically, their advice is to get under your desk, hold your hands over your head, and that'll save you from an atomic bomb. All right, I mean, we can debate later on whether or not this is an actual effective way to save yourself from the bomb, but I suppose that it's a way to just protect yourself from any sort of falling debris or anything that would happen in the case of an attack. So more importantly than what duck and cover actually means is just the fact that this video was created. Why did the U.S. government create this video to show to children in schools? Why did children in schools have duck and cover drills where they would have to stop what they were doing and get under their desks? The answer is that in the 1950s and 1960s and even into the 70s and 80s later on, but mostly more in the 50s and the 60s, is that the threat of nuclear war was constant. And the reason why the threat of nuclear war was so constant is because the United States gets wrapped up with the Soviet Union into what was called the Cold War. So let's start on the first part of your sheet here, and let's look at the paragraph at the top of your sheet. Amid the rubble of war, a new power structure emerged. In Europe, Germany was defeated. France and Britain were drained and exhausted. Two other powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had brought about the final victory. Before long, these two nations would become superpowers with economic resources and military might to dominate the globe. They would also become tense rivals in an increasingly divided world. This rivalry would become a decades-long struggle known as the Cold War. So a couple of things that are important there in that paragraph to note. First of all, Germany, France, and Britain. Germany defeated, France and Britain drained and exhausted. Those three nations were the most powerful nations in Europe leading up into the 20th century. The 19th century, if you remember, was also the age of Western European powers. So France, Germany, and Britain, especially Britain, were the major world powers going into the 20th century. Now, World War I and World War II will mark the decline of those two powers, of those three powers. The peak of Western European power is World War II. The wars really decrease their power a lot, it hurts their nations, and in their wake now emerged the United States, the United States was the only major power untouched by the war. No attacks there, nothing. In fact, their economy boomed because of the war. So the United States is in a great position in 1945 to adopt this superpower status. The other superpower will be the Soviet Union. Although the Soviet Union is drastically impacted by the war, which we'll get a little more to that in a little bit, their economy, which focused a lot on the production of heavy industry and weapons and military might, recovers themselves and also emerges here now as the second world superpower. The tensions between these two nations, which have their roots in the ideologies between communism and capitalism, the tensions here, which were put aside during the Second World War to defeat their common enemy, Germany, those tensions now come to the surface and erupt into the Cold War. So the definition of the Cold War is a state of tension and hostility among nations without armed conflict between the major rivals. That's what defines a Cold War, quote unquote, cold, because there's no major armed conflict between the two major rivals. In this case, from 1945 to 1991, the rivals will be the United States, which again is that's your capitalism. Oh my gosh, I'm going to try to write this, but I am not using a pen and I'm using a mouse pad, so my handwriting here is even worse than normal. And it even looks more like a little child is trying to do this. Capitalism. Okay, capitalism. And I'm not going to bother writing it, but you guys can add it in. And the USSR would be communism. So we have the differing ideologies, capitalism/democracy and communism. And that's what defines this Cold War. So very shortly after the war in 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to Westminster College in Missouri and delivered an address analyzing the Soviet threat in Eastern Europe. Winston Churchill, he was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. He's replaced in 1945 by Clement Attlee. So in 1946, he's no longer the Prime Minister, but he is still a major important figure in politics. So in this speech here, he lays out exactly what the situation in Europe is like post-World War II. So I'd like everybody now just to stop for a minute, read over this excerpt, and answer the two questions below it, please. That's right. Pause the video, stop the video, read the document, answer the questions. Don't worry, I'll wait. Okay, so in here, there's a couple of things to note. This phrase here becomes his famous phrase in this speech. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. So he's saying here that post World War II, Europe has been now divided between democratic nations and communist nations. And he sees as a threat here that the Soviet Union is trying to expand their powers, expand their doctrines. And what doctrine is he talking about here? He's talking about communism. So that is what he sees as the real threat here. And this speech shows exactly what the situation is like in the early years of the Cold War. So the phrase that sticks here is the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain comes to now mean the barrier separating the Soviet bloc in the East and then the West during the Cold War. So this cartoon here shows you an actual iron wall. There was not an actual iron wall that was built across Europe. This was a metaphorical barrier. It represented the division of the states, yes, and we'll see a map soon that'll show you this, but it also represented the division between the ideologies of communism and capitalism that will define this whole period in the second half of the 20th century. You can see here that the people are going to be the ones that get divided between this Iron Curtain and crushed between it. All right, so let's get to the origins of the Cold War. How does it start? You can see here in these pictures the Soviet soldiers and American soldiers at the end of World War II. They're happy, they're celebrating, they've got their arms around each other, they're sharing cigarettes, they're smiling, they're bros, everyone's happy, they're friends. This image does not last very much longer. There was always distrust between the communist nations the communist nation of the Soviet Union and the Western democratic nations. However, with a common enemy, they were able to put these tensions aside. Hence why you see here the celebration and this buddy-buddiness, with their arms around each other. But once you get that common enemy taken away, the tensions rise to the surface pretty much immediately. So go to the third page of your packet where it says, how did the Cold War start? And let's fill in some of these notes here. Well, the key main reason of the start of the Cold War is these differing ideologies. Communism versus capitalism. Two ideologies, completely different, each side believing that they had the best method to how a society should function. So that's the core of this Cold War. You also see here Stalin's deep distrust of Western Europe. So the World War II had made his distrust of the West even worse. Why? Well, the answer is because of the invasion of the Soviet Union. There's approximately 21 million people killed in the invasion of the Soviet Union. So Stalin is very much aware of the fact of another invasion from the West would be very devastating to his country. And if you look at the next slide here with this chart here, that shows you the military deaths. Take a look at how much the Soviet Union suffered. 64% of the deaths in World War II were from the Soviet Union. More than half, a good portion of the deaths here from the Allies alone was the Soviet Union. The United States, 2%. United Kingdom, 2%. France, 1%. So his allies here from the West made up about 5% of the deaths, whereas he made up 64%. So he's very nervous about another invasion from the West. He feels like his Western allies didn't do enough, didn't have their fair share of the war, didn't have the same burden that he did, didn't sacrifice as much as his country did. So once the war's over, he has this deep distrust of them, and that also contributes to the tensions that'll cause the Cold War. So before the war even ends, the big three, Winston Churchill, FDR, and Joseph Stalin, meet at Yalta. They met in Yalta in February of 1945, which is before Germany's surrender. And they met to determine how they would deal with the defeat of Germany. And the reason why this is important is this also has some of the roots of the Cold War. So stop the video here for a second and just read over on the screen what's agreed to at the Yalta Conference and see if you can point out here in this reading what is the significant things that are agreed to at Yalta. All right, pause the video. We'll come back in a minute. Okay, so at Yalta, here's what's important. Notice here this part. The establishment of order in Europe, and the rebuilding of national economic life must be achieved by processes which will enable the liberated peoples to destroy the last vestiges of Nazism and fascism and to create democratic institutions of their own choice. So they are agreeing here to create democratic governments in these areas where Nazism and fascism used to exist. That includes the areas that were taken over by Hitler in Eastern Europe during the war. So if you look at the third box again, to form interim governmental authorities broadly representative of all democratic elements in the population, that will be established through free elections of the governments responsible to the will of the people, and to facilitate, where necessary, the holding of such elections. So the big three, including Stalin here, have agreed that they are going to help democratic free elections be held in these areas that were conquered by Germany. That's one thing that's important at Yalta. The second thing here is they decide to divide Germany up into occupation zones. There will be 4 occupation zones, one handled by the French, one by the British, one by the Americans, and one by the Soviets. So this is what they agree to, and that's going to lay the foundation here for the Cold War to start. Later, after Germany has surrendered, the three meet again at Potsdam. This time, Truman has replaced FDR because FDR died. And Churchill, though he starts Potsdam, his government is defeated in the elections in Great Britain in 1945, and a new government is instituted, led by Clement Attlee. So Clement Attlee will replace Churchill. Stalin, however, is still there at Potsdam. Now, at Potsdam, they make the final document that would be the peace settlement here in Germany. So in the final document, they agree to that division of Germany. And they also, again, decide to resurrect German political life on a democratic basis. So once again here, they're saying that they're going to bring democratic governments to these former fascist areas, or areas that were dominated by Germany. Obviously, we know, spoiler alert everybody, that's not going to be the case in Eastern Europe. Stalin does not hold the free elections. So why? Let's look at this. This is a map here of Eastern Europe. Remember, this area here that's all covered here, that was area that was conquered by Hitler during the Second World War. Hitler gets as far into the Soviet Union, as far as Moscow. But after Stalingrad, the Soviet forces began pushing the Germans back. So these arrows here represent the Soviet army pushing the Germans back. They push them back, push them back, push them back until they're out of these occupied areas and back into Germany. And the Soviets push them all the way back to Berlin. So now as the Germans leave these areas, the Soviet army left behind occupying forces in these areas. So all these areas here were occupied by the Soviet army. And take a look here at what Stalin says. He says, whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system. Everyone imposes his own system as far as his armies can reach. It cannot be otherwise. So what is Stalin saying here? What are the implications of this? What he's saying is that wherever he occupies his area, he's going to put his own system in. So what is the implications, or what are the implications, is that he's not going to have free elections here. He's going to put his own system, a communist system, here in this area of Eastern Europe. Now, thinking about it, again, he doesn't trust the West. So by placing communist systems in here, it also creates a zone here of protection for him. There's no democratic nations right next to him, so he doesn't have to fear of another invasion from Germany or Britain or whoever might want to invade him. He's got this area here of a safety net of communist nations between them. So that's what happens, and that's how you start to see the division of Europe after the Second World War. All right, so this isn't somewhere on your worksheet, but if you want to maybe put it at the bottom of the sheet there, it is an important thing to note here about how the roots of the Cold War. So at Yalta and Potsdam, they agreed to divide up Germany and hold free elections. As we said, Stalin does not hold free elections at all. And instead, supported by the Red Army, communists in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other places in Eastern Europe destroy their rival political parties, assassinate democratic leaders, and establish communist governments here in the East. Okay? Sorry, I'll go back to this here. You can pause this to finish up your notes, write these down. Now, once you've written these down, let's go to the third page of how did the Cold War start and add these to the notes you already wrote. So now Stalin wants to spread communism and create a buffer zone for protection from Western nations. So what he does is these areas where the communist governments have taken charge, he establishes what are called satellite nations. Satellite nations are areas where communist governments tied to Moscow are set up. So these satellite nations are independent nations. However, they are dominated by Stalin, by the Soviet Union. They're basically little puppet states that do whatever the Soviet Union wants, even though they are independent. Now, these states do also have communist governments. So the result is by 1948, here is what Europe looks like. All the red areas are communist areas. The light areas are democratic capitalist areas. So this is what Churchill was talking about with that Iron Curtain that's divided Europe. So you can see here, this was the Iron Curtain. Again, metaphorical Iron Curtain, the division here between the East communist and the West capitalist democratic. So let's zoom in a little bit and look at what was called the Eastern Bloc. The Eastern Bloc are the areas that are communist during the Cold War. Well, these areas here, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, they actually just become part of the Soviet Union. These areas that the Red Army occupied are just brought into the Soviet Union. Now, Poland, East Germany, which we'll get to in a second how that happens, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, they become satellite states that were under the control of the Soviet Union. Now, Yugoslavia is a little bit different here. They are listed under satellite states because Yugoslavia does become a communist country. It is ruled by a communist dictator. However, that communist dictator named Joseph Tito was not a big fan of Joseph Stalin. The two of them did not get along, and Tito manages to stay outside the control of Stalin. So during the Cold War, Yugoslavia, even though it is a communist nation, does not really fall under the domination of the Soviet Union the way the rest of these nations did. So Yugoslavia is a little bit different than these other nations. They were probably, the United States viewed Yugoslavia as like a good, quote-unquote, communist nation just because they were against the Soviet Union also. So that's how you have here the setting up of these satellite states. So Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania. Those will be nations that are ruled by communist governments and will become part of this Eastern Bloc in this division of Europe. All right, so in the years immediately following World War II, you're going to see some increased tensions between the United States and their capitalist allies and the Soviet Union. So stop the video here once again. On your second page, you have a reading of the Cold War starts about the Marshall Plan, the division of Germany, and the Berlin Airlift. So stop the video here, read through those documents, and then fill out in your chart stuff about the Marshall Plan, the division of Germany, and the Berlin Airlift. So stop and we'll come back when you're done and go over some of these things. Okay, so for the Marshall Plan, let's talk about this. After the war, Europe is in shambles. They are physically destroyed. You can see in some of these pictures the destruction there. Remember, World War II is a total war. Bombings took place. You would bomb the crap out of a city first before you would be able to attack it and take it over. So that resulted in not only the deaths of many, many people, but the physical destruction of the country. Their economies were also destroyed. So the question is, how will this impact the growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union? The answer to that question is that both of these nations will be eager to help rebuild Europe in the attempt to attract people to their side. So for the United States, it's a very big fear that if they don't help Europe rebuild, that they will turn to communist countries or to communism to help them. Remember, when things are desperate and people are in bad shape, they are willing to accept radical ideas. So the fear is that if you keep Europe in these desperate states, the Western nations are going to go away from capitalism and turn to communism. They were very much aware of what happened in between the wars, what happened after World War I. And the fear is that, hey, if we don't help them, they're going to turn to communism. So that's where the Marshall Plan comes in. The Marshall Plan was proposed by a U.S. Secretary of State, and the plan was to send American money millions and millions of dollars of American money into Europe to help Europe rebuild. So you can see in this map here the amount of money that was given and where it was given to. Now, money was offered to these Eastern European nations that were also torn apart by war, but Joseph Stalin made sure that these nations did not accept help from the Americans, because his fear was that if they took money from the Americans, they would turn to capitalism. So the Eastern nations did not receive the same money. Now, the Marshall Plan ends up becoming incredibly important in helping to rebuild Europe after the war. Even though Europe is completely destroyed by the war and their economies are tanked by the war, somehow, miraculously, in the 1950s and 1960s, Western European nations' economies rebuild themselves and recover, and they actually have booming economies in the 50s and 60s. This was something that was called the economic miracle. And the Marshall Plan was really, really important in helping that economic miracle begin. All right, so in your box in the Marshall Plan, make sure you have this important information, that it was a program proposed by the U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall, in which the United States gave large amounts of economic aid to European countries to help them rebuild after the devastation of World War II. And again, make sure you note here that the U.S. feared that if these nations were not rebuilt, they would turn to communism. I would also add this this note here is that that the Marshall Plan was very instrumental in helping the European economies grow after the war. Okay, so that's the Marshall Plan. All right, now the division of Germany. As discussed before, at Yalta, it was decided that there would be 4 occupation zones for Germany, and each major power would occupy those zones. Now, pretty much as soon as the war ends, the Soviet Union moves to make their occupation zone more of a communist area. In the West, Great Britain, the United States, and France all decide to help rebuild West Germany, whereas the Soviet Union chose to pull all the stuff out of East Germany, their occupation zone, to help them rebuild themselves. So the result here is that you see a division of Germany. The Soviets make their state a communist state, whereas the British, the French, and the United States combine their zones together to create a democratic state. So the result is a division of Germany. East Germany, that becomes communist, and West Germany, that becomes a capitalist democratic state. So now, talking about Berlin. The capital of Berlin was also divided into 4 occupation zones because it was the capital. So once the war ends and Germany is divided, so is Berlin. So Berlin gets divided also into an East Berlin and a West Berlin. West Berlin remains capitalist, East Berlin becomes communist. Now, if you notice the location of the capital, it is deep within the Soviet zone. The capital itself is deep within East Germany. So Stalin thinks, hey, it's in our zone, the whole capital should belong to us. So in order to try to force Berlin to come over to their side and become now fully communist, he begins to blockade West Berlin from their help in West Germany. And he sets up this blockade on the ground where he basically prevents any resources or food or anything coming into West Berlin, with the idea here being that they will be desperate and want to get help from East Berlin and get help from the communists, and then the communists can take over the entire city. Well, he put a blockade on the ground, so the Western European nations respond with an airlift. They say, well, if you're going to blockade the ground, we're going to go through the air. And planes fly over Berlin day after day, just dropping supplies onto the ground for the West Berliners. And this is successful. West Berlin manages to survive the airlift, manages to survive the blockade, and Berlin will remain divided between East and West during the Cold War. The Berlin airlift, you should note here that Stalin believes Berlin should be within their control. He blockades Berlin from the west. The Western powers fly goods over to the trapped West Berliners by doing this, it forces the Soviets to end the blockade. And the result here is that Berlin will remain split between the East and the West. So you'll have a West Berlin, which will be capitalist, and an East Berlin, which will be communist. And then, yes, eventually in one of the later lessons, we'll talk about how the Berlin Wall is built. There is an actual wall built between East Berlin and West Berlin to divide the city. And we'll get to that a little bit later. All right, but the point is with the Berlin Airlift, it manages to help West Berlin remain part of the capitalist democratic societies. Okay, so now finally what we're going to wrap up with is now the military alliances that were formed here. So it wasn't just enough for the United States to economically help Europe. They also wanted to make sure that Western Europe would not be militarily threatened by the communists. There's that fear there that maybe the communists will turn to a Hitler-style invasion and try to actually take over the continent. So the United States spearheads the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. If you flip to the last page of your packet, it gives you a little summary of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So for the last time in this one, stop the video here, read over that, and then fill out your chart. Fill out the two terms in your chart, please. Okay. So NATO, what you should have written down is that NATO was a mutual defense pact signed by Western nations. It was spearheaded by the United States, and the idea was to protect themselves against Soviet aggression. So the whole key behind NATO was to have here a military alliance to protect themselves from the Soviet Union. Now, NATO does still exist today. If you just go to Google really quickly and you Google NATO, it comes up in the news. Just recently, yesterday, there was talks between NATO and Russia. That failed. Now, Russia is still not part of NATO, but at least today, I guess apparently they just had this dialogue, the first dialogue in 2 years of relations between NATO and Russia kind of getting better. But again, there is, just the point is that NATO is still something that exists today. Now, at the time, once NATO is created, the Soviet Union can't just have a whole alliance of nations against them, so they respond with the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is their response. It's its own military alliance, but as it noted in the reading, is that it was also used by the Soviet Union as a weapon to keep its control over its satellite nations, not just a military alliance. But this idea of responding, of like one time the West did something, and then the Soviets would have to respond, or if the Soviets did something, then the capitalist West would have to respond. That's something that you're going to see take place throughout the Cold War. In later lessons, we'll talk about the arms race, the space race, and it's this, besides just the tensions between them, there's also just this race to show that they're better. And they're always going to be trying to top each other and one-up each other. All right, so these are two questions that you now should be able to answer after watching these videos. I think it would be a really, really good idea, everybody, in the space below on your last page under the map of the Warsaw Pact and NATO, it's probably a really good idea to answer these two questions based on everything we discussed. It might be really beneficial for you to be able to answer these questions. All right, and so that is the end of this first lesson on the Cold War. If there's anything that you're not sure about, anything you want to go over, please make sure you're making notes of it on your page, and you can ask me when we return to class. Hope you guys learned something and that you were able to answer these questions, and I'll see you guys again in the next lesson on the Cold War. All right, thanks guys. Later.